The alarm pierced through Sarah's sleep at 6:30 a.m., dragging her from dreams she couldn't remember into a body that felt like it hadn't rested at all. 8 hours in bed, according to her sleep tracker, yet her muscles ached as if she'd been fighting something all night. She stared at the ceiling of her cramped Tokyo apartment, listening to the city already humming with activity 3 floors below. At 35, she'd become an expert at mornings that started with defeat. The scale in the bathroom corner seemed to mock her, the same number it had shown for months, despite the gym membership she barely used and the meal replacement shakes gathering dust in her kitchen cabinet. Her reflection revealed the familiar signs: puffiness around her eyes, a complexion that looked grey despite the expensive skincare routine, shoulders already tense before the day had even begun. Sarah had moved to Tokyo 2 years ago for a promotion that promised adventure, but delivered endless hours hunched over spreadsheets in a glass tower in Shibuya. The irony wasn't lost on her. She lived in a country famous for longevity and slimness, surrounded by people who seemed to glide through their days with an energy she couldn't manufacture, no matter how much coffee she consumed. The train to work was her daily laboratory for observation and envy. While she clutched her venti latte and scrolled through fitness influencers on her phone, the Japanese commuters around her sat quietly, some even dozing upright with a peacefulness that seemed impossible. How did they do it? How did her co-worker Kenji manage to look refreshed every morning despite working the same brutal hours? How did the elderly woman at the convenience store maintain such graceful posture while Sarah's back screamed from sleeping wrong? Doctor, Martinez had been gentle but direct during her last checkup. "Your cortisol levels are concerning," he'd said, pointing to numbers on her blood work that looked like a foreign language. "Your body is stuck in fight or flight mode. We need to talk about stress management and sleep hygiene." She'd nodded and promised to try meditation apps and earlier bedtimes, but her nervous system seemed to have its own agenda, one that involved racing thoughts at midnight and a heart that jumped at every email notification. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening when she found herself standing in the fluorescent glow of a 7-Eleven at 11 p.m., holding a basket filled with chocolate and instant ramen, realizing she couldn't remember eating lunch. Her reflection in the glass door showed someone she barely recognized, a person running on fumes, dressed in expensive clothes, but radiating exhaustion. That's when she noticed Kenji at the register, purchasing what looked like a simple bento box and a small container of miso soup. His movements were unhurried, almost ceremonial, as he bowed slightly to the cashier and carefully placed his items in a bag. There was something in his demeanor that made her pause, not the frantic energy of someone grabbing fuel to push through another late night, but the calm attention of someone who understood something she didn't. "Long day?" she found herself asking as they walked toward the exit together. "Every day is long," he replied with a small smile. "But some days we remember to breathe." She wanted to laugh at what sounded like fortune cookie wisdom, but something in his tone stopped her. Here was someone who worked the same demanding schedule, navigated the same pressures, yet seemed to possess a secret she desperately needed to learn. Walking back to her apartment, Sarah found herself thinking about the small ceramic rice bowl she'd inherited from her grandmother, a woman who had lived to 92 and never owned a gym membership. The bowl sat forgotten in her cabinet, replaced by oversized plates and takeout containers. Her grandmother had measured portions not with apps or scales, but with her hands, and this simple vessel that somehow made every meal feel intentional. That night, for the first time in months, Sarah served her instant ramen in the ceramic bowl instead of eating straight from the cup. The portion looked smaller, almost inadequate, but as she ate slowly, there was something about the weight of the bowl in her hands that demanded attention. She noticed flavors she usually missed in her hurried consumption. The warmth spread through her chest in a way that felt different from the usual rush to fill an empty stomach. As she washed the bowl afterward, running her fingers over its smooth surface, Sarah wondered if she'd been thinking about change all wrong. Maybe the answer wasn't another extreme diet or punishing workout routine. Maybe it was something smaller, quieter, something that had been sitting in her cabinet all along, waiting to teach her a different way of being. If you've ever felt tired even after a full night of sleep, or frustrated with diets that don't last, tell us in the comments which part of this story feels familiar, and stay with us for the next chapters. The ceramic bowl became Sarah's quiet rebellion against the chaos of her Tokyo routine. Each morning, she measured her rice portion using the bowl's natural boundaries, a practice that felt almost meditative compared to her usual grab-and-go breakfast bars. The first week, she felt constantly hungry, as if she was depriving herself. But by the second week, something shifted. Her body began to expect the rhythm, the pause, the actual act of sitting down to eat. Kenji noticed the bento box she'd started bringing to work, modest portions arranged in compartments, each item distinct and visible. "My grandmother always said the eyes should eat first," he mentioned during a rare lunch break they shared in the office's tiny break room. "When you can see everything, you taste everything." Sarah had been skeptical of what sounded like another Japanese saying that lost something in translation, but she found herself actually tasting her food for the first time in years. The pickled vegetables she'd initially dismissed as weird began to provide a sharp contrast that made the rice more satisfying. The small piece of grilled fish felt substantial, rather than insufficient, when she ate it slowly, paying attention to texture and flavor instead of scrolling through her phone. Her friend Rachel from the gym wasn't impressed. "You're basically starving yourself with those tiny portions," she said during their weekly coffee meeting in Harajuku. "My trainer says you need to eat every 3 hours to keep your metabolism going. And where are the protein shakes, the supplements?" Sarah wanted to explain that she wasn't hungry between meals anymore, that the strange combination of satisfaction and lightness she felt after eating from the bowl was different from the stuffed then starving cycle she'd lived with for years. But how do you describe something that sounds like nothing to someone who measures success in grams of protein and hours logged at CrossFit? The real test came during her first business dinner since starting what she'd begun thinking of as the bowl practice. Sitting across from clients at an upscale restaurant in Ginza, Sarah watched plates of elaborate courses arrive, portions that would have sent her into a spiral of guilt and compensation planning just months before. But something had changed. She found herself naturally eating slowly, putting down her chopsticks between bites, engaging in conversation rather than focusing on finishing everything on her plate. "You seem different," her colleague Tanaka observed as they walked back to the station. "More present." The word surprised her. Present. When had she last felt present during a meal, during a conversation, during the simple act of existing in her own body? She thought about her mornings back in Chicago, standing over the kitchen sink, wolfing down toast while checking emails, her nervous system already activated for the day's battles before she'd even left her apartment. That night, preparing her simple dinner in the ceramic bowl, Sarah realized she'd stopped thinking about food as fuel or enemy. The bowl's modest size had taught her something about enough, not the punishing restriction of her past diet attempts, but a gentle boundary that allowed her to notice satisfaction before it tipped into discomfort. Her sleep-tracking app showed a subtle but consistent change, fewer nighttime wake-ups, longer periods of deep sleep. Her body wasn't working overtime to digest massive late-night meals or process the sugar crashes from her previous eating pattern. The chronic indigestion that had become her normal was fading, replaced by a lightness she'd forgotten was possible. But the changes went beyond the physical. Using the bowl required her to pause, to make actual decisions about what and how much to eat, rather than mindlessly consuming whatever was convenient. Each meal became a small practice in attention, in caring for herself in a way that felt sustainable rather than punitive. "Doctor, Martinez would later describe it as nervous system regulation, but Sarah experienced it as simply feeling more like herself. The bowl had become a teacher, showing her the difference between eating and nourishing, between filling space and creating satisfaction. In a culture obsessed with more protein, more workouts, more restriction, more rules, this small ceramic vessel from her grandmother's kitchen was teaching her about the profound power of enough. 3 months into her bowl practice, Sarah's lab results told a story her doctor couldn't quite explain with conventional metrics. Her inflammation markers had dropped significantly, her cortisol levels were approaching normal range, and her blood sugar showed the steady patterns of someone whose body trusted when the next meal would come. "What changed?" Dr. Martinez asked, flipping through her chart with genuine curiosity. "Your numbers look like someone who's been on a comprehensive lifestyle program." Sarah almost laughed. "I started eating from a smaller bowl," she said, knowing how ridiculous it sounded in the sterile efficiency of the medical office, "and I stopped eating while standing or looking at screens." The doctor's pause was telling. In his world of complex interventions and pharmaceutical solutions, a ceramic bowl seemed almost insulting in its simplicity. But the blood work didn't lie, and neither did the woman sitting across from him, who looked more rested than she had in their previous 3 appointments. The real validation came from unexpected sources. Her clothes fit differently, not dramatically, but with a comfort she'd forgotten was possible. The chronic bloating that had made her feel thick and sluggish throughout the day had disappeared. Her skin had a clarity that expensive serums had never delivered. Even her hair seemed healthier, though she couldn't explain why, but the changes created their own challenges. Her friendship with Rachel grew strained as Sarah declined invitations to try the latest extreme fitness classes or trendy elimination diets. "You've gotten so boring," Rachel complained, after Sarah chose tea over cocktails for the 3rd weekend in a row. "It's like you've turned into one of those Zen people who's too good for fun." Zashil. The accusation stung because it contained a grain of truth. Sarah was changing, and the changes made other people uncomfortable. Her Japanese colleagues seemed to approve. Several had complimented her on looking more relaxed. But her Western friends interpreted her new rhythms as judgment of their own choices. The tension came to a head during a visit from her sister Lisa, who arrived from Los Angeles full of energy and diet advice. "You look great, but you're eating like a bird," Lisa observed, watching Sarah's careful portioning during their dinner at a traditional kaiseki restaurant in Kyoto. "Don't you think you're being a little obsessive about this Japanese thing?" Sarah wanted to explain that it wasn't obsession but the opposite, freedom from the constant mental noise about food that had dominated her thoughts for years. The bowl had taught her to trust her body's signals rather than external rules about what she should want or need. But explaining this to Lisa, who was already planning her next juice cleanse while photographing her elaborate 7-course meal, felt impossible. "I'm not being obsessive," Sarah said quietly, holding her small cup of tea. "I'm being intentional." The distinction mattered, though she struggled to articulate why. Obsession was the frantic energy that had driven her through years of extreme diets and punishment workouts. Intention was this new quality of attention she brought to simple activities: eating, sleeping, even breathing. The bowl had been just the beginning, a physical anchor that taught her what it felt like to approach her own needs with curiosity rather than judgment. Kenji helped her understand this during one of their occasional lunch conversations. "My grandmother lived through the war," he shared, unwrapping his simple bento. "She never wasted food, but she also never hurried through meals. She said both were forms of disrespect to the food and to yourself." Sarah thought about this as she watched tourists at the temple near her apartment rushing through their visits, cameras capturing everything but experiencing nothing. She'd been living like a tourist in her own body for years, documenting calories and workout minutes, but missing the actual experience of being alive in her skin. The bowl had become her teacher in presence, but the lessons extended beyond meals. She found herself walking more slowly to the station, noticing the way morning light fell across the city streets. She left her phone in another room while eating, discovering silence she hadn't experienced since childhood. Small changes that seemed insignificant were accumulating into something that felt like a different way of being human. Would you rather force yourself with willpower or redesign your environment and habits like this character is learning to do? Comment which path makes more sense to you, and share this episode with someone who needs a gentler approach to change. The test came 6 months later when Sarah's company announced a major restructuring that would require 3 weeks of 18-hour days leading up to a crucial client presentation. The old Sarah would have stocked up on energy drinks, ordered takeout to her desk, and pushed through on pure adrenaline and caffeine. This version of herself faced a choice: abandon her new rhythms for the crisis or find a way to maintain her practice under pressure. The ceramic bowl came with her to the office. While her colleagues survived on convenience store sandwiches and vending machine coffee, Sarah continued her ritual of mindful portions. She kept rice balls and pickled vegetables in the office refrigerator, using her break periods not for scrolling social media, but for quiet meals at her desk. The bowl's familiar weight in her hands became an anchor of calm in the storm of deadlines and demands. "How are you not exhausted?" her teammate David asked on day 10 of the brutal schedule. He was pale and shaky from too much caffeine and too little real food. "I feel like I'm dying, and you look like you just came back from vacation." Sarah realized that her nervous system had learned a different response pattern. Where stress used to trigger a cycle of caffeine, sugar, and eventual crash, she found herself naturally reaching for steadier sources of energy. Her body had become accustomed to consistent, gentle nourishment rather than the feast or famine pattern that had defined her previous work crises. But the real revelation came during the client presentation itself. Standing before a room full of executives, Sarah felt the familiar surge of anxiety, but noticed something different in her body's response. Instead of the racing heart and shallow breathing that used to accompany high-pressure moments, she felt grounded, steady. The months of eating slowly, of paying attention to her body's signals, had taught her nervous system a new baseline of calm. The presentation went flawlessly, but more importantly, Sarah didn't collapse afterward. While her colleagues needed days to recover from the intense period, she felt tired but not depleted. The sustainable energy that came from consistent care rather than forced stimulation had carried her through in a way that willpower never could have. Genji noticed the change immediately when they returned to normal schedules. "You didn't break," he observed with quiet approval. "Many people break when pressure comes. They abandon everything they know is good for them." Sarah understood what he meant. She'd watched colleagues use stress as an excuse to abandon healthy habits, eating garbage because they were too busy for real meals, skipping sleep because deadlines demanded sacrifice. But she'd discovered that crisis was exactly when gentle practices mattered most, when her body needed consistency rather than additional chaos. The bowl had taught her something profound about sustainability. Real health wasn't about perfect conditions, but about maintaining essential practices even when life became demanding. The small ceramic vessel had been her training ground for resilience, teaching her that caring for herself wasn't selfish luxury, but necessary foundation. Dr. Martinez was amazed at her latest blood work, taken right after the stressful work period. "Your cortisol barely spiked," he said, comparing her results to previous years when work pressure had sent her stress hormones through the ceiling. "Your body handled that crisis like someone with years of meditation practice." That evening, preparing her dinner in the familiar ritual, Sarah reflected on how dramatically her relationship with stress had changed. The bowl sat in her hands with its usual weight, holding not just rice, but the accumulated wisdom of months spent learning to trust her body's rhythms rather than override them with willpower and stimulants. She thought about her grandmother, who had used this same bowl through decades of meals, never knowing she was teaching lessons about presence and enough. The ceramic felt warm from the rice, smooth from countless washings, permanent in a way that felt both comforting and instructive. Some things were worth maintaining, worth returning to, worth building a life around. The revelation came not in a moment of crisis, but in a mundane Tuesday morning, as Sarah prepared her breakfast with the same careful attention she'd practiced for nearly a year. As she scooped rice into the ceramic bowl, she realized she was no longer the person who had stood in that convenience store, basket full of comfort food, running on empty and desperate for something to fill the void. The central secret wasn't about the bowl itself, though it had been the perfect teacher. The secret was that she had been approaching her body like an enemy to be controlled rather than an ally to be understood. Every diet, every extreme workout, every attempt at willpower had been a declaration of war against her own nervous system. The bowl had taught her a different possibility: cooperation. "I think I understand now why nothing worked before," she told Dr. Martinez during her routine checkup. Her lab results had stabilized into patterns he called textbook healthy, but more importantly, she felt at home in her own skin for the first time in decades. "Tell me," he said, genuinely curious about this transformation that had happened without pharmaceutical intervention or complex protocols. "I was trying to force my body to ignore its signals," Sarah explained. "Every diet was about overriding hunger, every workout was about pushing through discomfort, every healthy habit was about not trusting what I felt. The bowl taught me to pay attention instead of push through." Dr. Martinez nodded slowly. "You're describing nervous system regulation through behavioral change. When you stopped treating your body as the enemy, it stopped behaving like one." The insight rippled through every aspect of Sarah's life. She realized she'd been approaching sleep the same way, forcing herself to stay awake when tired, then forcing herself to sleep when wired. Her new rhythm honored fatigue as information rather than weakness, leading to the deep rest that had eluded her for years. Her relationships had shifted too. Friends who'd initially been skeptical of her changes began asking quiet questions about her apparent calm. Rachel, who'd been critical of Sarah's boring new habits, confessed during a rare dinner together that she was exhausted from constantly fighting her own body through extreme fitness and restriction cycles. "How did you stop being so hard on yourself?" Rachel asked, watching Sarah eat with obvious enjoyment rather than the guilt or anxiety that used to characterize her relationship with food. "I started treating myself like someone I was trying to help instead of someone I was trying to punish," Sarah answered, surprised by the simplicity of the truth. The bowl sat between them on the restaurant table. Sarah had taken to carrying it with her for meals out, no longer embarrassed by what others might think. It had become a symbol of self-respect, a physical reminder that she was worth the attention required for genuine care. Kenji understood this transformation intuitively. "In Japan, we have a concept called omotenashi," he explained during one of their lunch conversations. "It means wholehearted service, treating each person with complete attention and respect. You learn to give omotenashi to yourself." The phrase resonated deeply. Sarah realized she'd been trying to serve everyone else: her job, her family's expectations, her friends' social plans, her culture's demands for productivity and achievement, while treating her own needs as inconvenient obstacles to manage or override. The bowl had been her first lesson in treating herself with the same care she would offer a beloved friend. Each meal had become a small act of service to her own well-being, accumulating into a completely different way of being alive. Not perfect, not always easy, but sustainable in a way that willpower and external motivation had never been. The ceramic surface, worn smooth by countless meals, had taught her that transformation didn't require dramatic gestures or extreme measures. It happened through simple, repeated acts of attention and respect, building trust between her mind and body, one mindful portion at a time. 2 years later, Sarah found herself in an unexpected role as mentor to Emma, a new hire from London, who radiated the same exhausted intensity Sarah remembered from her own early Tokyo days. Emma had already asked about the best gyms, the most effective diet plans, the supplements that might help her manage the demanding schedule and cultural adjustment. "I've tried everything," Emma confessed over coffee, her hands shaking slightly from what was clearly her fourth or fifth cup of the day. "I thought moving to Japan would somehow make me healthier by proximity, but I feel worse than ever." Sarah listened to Emma describe the familiar cycle: extreme restriction followed by late-night binges, punishing workouts followed by exhaustion, sleep aids followed by caffeine dependence. The story was so familiar, it felt like listening to her former self speak from across time. "Want to try something that sounds too simple to work?" Sarah asked, pulling the ceramic bowl from her bag. It had become her constant companion, no longer a source of embarrassment, but a symbol of the life she'd built around attention rather than force. Emma's skeptical expression was exactly what Sarah had expected. The bowl looked like nothing special, just a small ceramic vessel, worn smooth from use, significant only in the care with which Sarah handled it. "My grandmother used this bowl for 70 years, Sarah explained, running her fingers along its familiar surface. "She lived to 92, never counted a calorie, never owned a scale. I inherited it, but didn't understand what she was really leaving me until I started using it." She shared the story of her own transformation, not as a miracle cure, but as a slow rebuilding of trust between her mind and body. The bowl had been her teacher in portions, in patience, in the radical idea that her body deserved care rather than control. Emma was intrigued, despite herself. "So you just eat from a smaller bowl? That's it?" "That's where it starts," Sarah said. "But it's not about the size. It's about the attention, about treating each meal like it matters, like you matter." 6 months later, Dr. Martinez reviewed Sarah's annual physical with the satisfaction of a doctor whose patient had become a case study in sustainable wellness. Her blood pressure, cholesterol, inflammation markers, and stress hormones all remained in optimal ranges despite the normal pressures of Tokyo work life. "You've maintained these improvements for over 2 years now," he noted. "That's unusual. Most people cycle back to old patterns." Sarah thought about this as she walked home through the familiar streets of her neighborhood. The bowl's lessons had expanded far beyond meals. She approached work with the same intentional rhythm, setting boundaries that protected her energy rather than depleting it. Her relationships had deepened as she learned to be fully present rather than constantly distracted by internal battles with her own needs. The ceramic bowl sat in its place of honor in her kitchen, ready for the evening meal that had become a cherished ritual rather than a source of anxiety. Tomorrow, Emma would join her for dinner, beginning her own experiment with attention over force, with cooperation over control. Sarah smiled as she prepared her rice, measuring the portion with movements that had become second nature. The bowl held exactly enough, never too little, never too much. It had taught her that enough was not about deprivation, but about trust, not about external rules, but about internal wisdom. Her grandmother had left her more than a simple ceramic vessel. She had left her a teacher, a practice, a way of caring for herself that honored both tradition and individual needs. The bowl had revealed what Sarah now understood as the deepest secret of sustainable health: the willingness to treat your own body with the same respect and attention you would offer someone you truly loved. The warmth of the bowl in her hands felt like coming home to herself again and again, one mindful meal at a time. If this story reminded you that real transformation comes from small habits repeated over time, not from overnight fixes, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to start this journey with you in the next story.